Good evening and welcome to the Science for Seminary virtual dialogue series. You have just come to our campus-wide event, which is on the topic of science denial. I'm so excited that you came because science denial is such a huge topic, and we have two of the nation's, probably the world's primary experts on this topic. We would love to welcome here at MTSO psychologists and authors Gale, Sinatra, and Barbara, I hope I'm saying this right, Hofer? Yep. Okay, very good. To discuss pressing issues related to science denial and the role of religion. So, without further ado, and not a lot of introduction, I want to introduce you to Dr. Gale Sinatra and Dr. Barbara Hofer.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having us. We're delighted to join you and your guests today. As you said, I'm Gale Sinatra from the University of Southern California. And of course, Barbara is here from Middlebury College in Vermont. We are delighted to be talking to you today about this really important topic that we care a lot about, public understanding of science. Why does that matter? Well, we think it matters because we feel that democratic societies depend on citizens to make informed decisions. And a lot of these decisions involve scientific issues. And that's needed for the good of our health and well-being, for communities, nations, and even the planet. A lot of the issues that are current that you've probably been hearing about and thinking about that involve science, things like vaccinations, climate change, fracking, stem cell research, genetically modified organisms that we eat for food, pandemic response, all of these are really complicated issues that involve a lot of scientific claims, and they're challenging to understand these claims and premises of the science itself. So it's no wonder that there can be a disconnect between scientists' views and that of the general public. We are educators, and we really believe in the ability of science to help us to understand the natural world. And so we say we need to improve science education. Nationally, there's recommended standards called the Next Generation Science Standards, which give us ideas about how we can understand the natural world and teach about that to students. Content knowledge is really, really not enough, though, because many of these topics are very complicated and difficult to understand, and they require skills to evaluate the scientific evidence that really transcends just the content that we're typically taught in textbooks. So science literacy has to go way beyond that, more to the knowledge of science itself, and how is it that scientists know what they know? How is it that they produce this scientific knowledge? What are the origins of it? How do they validate it? And there are limits to what science can do and what scientists know. And those are very important limits for people to understand as well.
So along those lines, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science has produced this document that talks about the 4 basic principles that scientists accept. And they've distilled it down to this in order to give the public a chance to really understand what is science? How do we know these things? And these are the very principles that have been adopted by the Next Generation Science Standards that Gale just mentioned. These are things they want taught to students. So one is that the world is understandable through systematic study. That this is what scientists do. They try to make better sense of the world through particular methods. And yet there's a deep acknowledgement that science cannot provide complete answers to all questions. And we'll talk about this more in terms of what are the kinds of questions religion can answer, what are the kind of questions that science can answer. Scientific knowledge is also durable, it's lasting, it endures. and scientific ideas are subject to change. So on this latter issue, you can think about the ways in which this is an underlying premise of science, that as we get better tools, more information, more knowledge, new ways of looking at things, that topics will change, our knowledge will change. And yet that's often confused with uncertainty. So an example would be, think about the novel coronavirus, and it was called novel for a reason. We'd never seen it before. And so initially, epidemiologists, CDC, et cetera, thought that it was probably transmitted through contact, through fomites. And so they were recommending for people to wash down their groceries. And remember when we were all doing that and wash their hands all the time? And then they figured out that it was actually airborne through small droplets. And so masks were more important. Well, if you understand that this is a normal scientific progression, that as they study something, they get better understanding of it, then this perfectly makes sense. But what happens often is that people think, they don't know anything. They're just flip-flopping. And that's a very dangerous place to be, to think that somehow scientists have to always be sure and always be certain. And they can't change their minds because they're taking in new information and they're figuring out how things really work. So Naomi Oreskes, who's a historian of science at Harvard, talks about, well, why should we trust science? And she has a lovely book with that title. And I'm going to distill it into just 4 basic ideas here. But that one is that science relies on empirical evidence. It's carefully collected and analyzed. So again, there are these methods that scientists go about of gathering data, analyzing that data, interpreting it. And it builds on prior findings, accumulating evidence over time. So that's another central premise, that you're figuring out what came before, what do we already know, how do we build on that? And it's a collective enterprise. It relies on peer review and the expert vetting of ideas, theories, and results. So what happens when somebody wants to publish something is it has to be read by other experts in the field. That's what peer review is. And it doesn't get published until it's past that standard. But it's not infallible. And we know horrible examples of where it has failed us. The classic one that people often talk about with vaccinations is when Andrew Wakefield published an article that vaccinations were linked to autism. It was discredited, it was revoked, his license was revoked. Science self-corrects. They figure out when there have been those errors. And one piece we really like from Lee McIntyre, who's a philosopher of science, is what he calls a scientific attitude. That what we really need to encourage is an openness to seek new evidence and a willingness to change one's mind in light of new evidence. So this is how individuals can think scientifically in a way that's effective for addressing the world. And yet what we have is science denial, doubt, and resistance, sadly. And when we started writing this book, we realized we didn't want to talk just about denial, which is the extreme form, but also about doubt and resistance and all these other responses that all of us as human beings have to particular facts that we may be perturbed by. So denial, however, is a belief-based stance. It's a rejection of evidence. So you can think about people who think climate change is a hoax, or that the earth is flat, or that vaccinations cause autism. That's a rejection of what scientists actually know to be true. And yet people will cling to those particular beliefs. But it's mostly what's been called cafeteria denial. In other words, there are very few people who deny science outright, but they choose what to believe from scientific findings and what to deny. So the people who go to the Flat Earth Conference every year are probably getting on an airplane or in a car. They're certainly not walking there from far away. And they trust those particular vehicles to get them there safely. There's certainly science at work there, but they're going to question whether the Earth is really round or not. So that's cafeteria denial. But what we have found is that doubt and resistance are really common, and especially when findings don't fit with what you already believe or conflict with your identity or require deeper thought. And we'll talk about this when we look at psychological explanations. Really critically is that doubt can also be manufactured by vested interests. So Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway wrote a lovely book along these lines, Merchants of Doubt, looking at how various companies, starting with the tobacco industry, for example, which really wanted to continue to sell as much as they could, and yet they had deep evidence that it did cause cancer, but they wanted to create some doubt around that. So they hired a PR firm to to really foment the doubt about whether there was a link or not. The petroleum industry used the same playbook with climate change and the same PR firm. But skepticism, however, as opposed to doubt, resistance, and denial, is a healthy part of the scientific process. So we think about what it means to be skeptical. When you're reading something about, should I take dewormer in order to cure my COVID or prevent COVID or something, you want to be skeptical. You want to think clearly. You want to read more deeply. That kind of skepticism is really good, as opposed to being skeptical of everything. And a caveat that we talk about all the time is that the kinds of things we're going to talk about psychologically, we're all susceptible to them. It's not an us and them issue. It's not as though there are people out there who don't trust science and there are people who always do. There are reasons why we all have psychological mechanisms that cause us to doubt or resist or deny.
And one challenge is the way science is communicated, certainly through some of the cable television news that people do tend to watch. There's this idea that you have to have balanced reporting where you present both sides of a scientific issue. But this can result in a lot of confusion, particularly if the issue has been resolved. So popular discourse then begins to veer from the scientific discourse and focus instead on the argument, and it seems disproportionate. It gives a lot of visibility to those denialists and makes it seem 50-50. And some of these issues are clearly not 50-50. They're much more resolved than the debate on television programming may appear. This is why the BBC stopped doing this. They prohibited this idea of putting on a climate scientist and a climate science denier on against each other, because really, since the newest IPCC report, the overwhelming consensus is that humans are contributing to climate change. So there really isn't a debate about those causal mechanisms within science anymore. So it's really kind of manufacturing doubt and creating confusion and exploiting the already existing confusion over the uncertainty when we say, oh, let's have this balanced reporting. It's really balance as bias at that point. Well, how do people make sense of of science claims in a digital world? We obviously get most of our science information online now, not from cable news television, but instead we look online. Science denial is hardly new. It goes back to the days of Galileo and Darwin. But now denial is really amplified through the social media in internet platforms. We see a ton of science information, but we also see a ton of science misinformation. And that's just incorrect information that is shared. And a lot of times people don't even know that it is incorrect. And then there's disinformation. And disinformation is when people know that it's incorrect, but they're sharing it anyway, either for political or monetary gain. And that's even worse because they know what they're doing. And these situations are really exacerbated by the fact that we're all tend to be in echo chambers, and we have these filter bubbles that really restrict what it is we see. And we get online and, our existing beliefs tend to be reinforced because we just see more people who agree with us because those are the people we're following. And we would very much encourage social media to do more to regulate the misinformation that's proliferating, much of which can be very dangerous.
So what we need are updated skills for evaluating information. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but algorithms are these basic organizing principles of digital life, and yet they're seldom understood. So you can think about the ways in which that works, whether it's on Facebook, sending you more of what you already liked, or Netflix recommending a film, or a dating site, or whatever it might be. They're the invisible hand behind all of what we see online. A Google search, any of those things, algorithms are deciding what to return to us. And the Pew Charitable Trust has said that what we need is not just information literacy in our schools and among the populace, but we need algorithmic literacy. We need to understand how this operates behind the scenes to give us information that we think may be true. But in fact, Facebook doesn't care if it's true or not. Facebook's going to give you more of what you already liked. And if it's a falsehood, that is not in the equation of what they're going to return to you. But online sources can be really difficult to assess for validity, accuracy, and bias. So Sam Weinberg at Stanford did a study of middle, high school, and college students, and his conclusion was that he was surprised by how many were easily duped. They really weren't able to discern bias in articles he asked them to read, or to figure out who was behind it, or to look at a Google search and figure out who supported that particular site. So there really are problems in deciding what's valid, and we really want to acknowledge that. And some people are more likely to believe science articles posted by their friends on Facebook than from expert sources. And of course, people live in their social media bubbles, and we have an erosion of trust and expertise. Tom Nichols has written about this really persuasively, but this idea that trust has been eroded for quite a while now in experts. And so we're odd in the world in some ways, in the degree to which scientists are not as highly regarded as they are in many places. So what we wanted to do in this book was really talk about what are the psychological explanations for science denial, doubt, and resistance. And what we did was read really massively. We've also done a lot of research of our own to try to look at what are the basic sort of mechanisms at work that help explain how this happens. And there are thinking and reasoning biases, of course. We all have them. Another caveat here. This isn't something other people have and we don't. We all have them. And the Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist Daniel Kahneman talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. And what he says is that system 1 is this quick, intuitive response, and that system 2 is harder. It's slower, it's deliberative, it's analytical, it's reflective. And yet we tend to over rely on system 1. And you can think about that anytime you're doing a search online. It's just really easy to just quickly say, okay, I'll trust that because my friend sent it to me or whatever, rather than thinking, okay, I better look a little deeper. And it's not that system 1 is all bad. We all need that. We'd be exhausted if we only did system 2 thinking, but we need to know when to employ it. Another thinking and reasoning bias is what you may have heard of. It's more commonly talked about, but that's confirmation bias. And this is the human tendency to seek, interpret, and recall information that just fits with what we already think we believe. And that could be as simple as, think about any Google search you've done, maybe where you're trying to settle an argument with a friend. And as soon as something comes up that fits with what you already believe, you're, aha, see, here it is, rather than really going through and vetting all the information. And that happens to us all the time in all kinds of contexts. And then there's the availability heuristic, where we believe information we have available to us. And this photo of Senator James Inhofe bringing a snowball to the floor of Congress because it was snowing in Washington, D.C., for him, this was proof that climate change was not really happening. If it could snow in Washington, this was a huge snowstorm, well, that invalidated climate change. That's the availability heuristic. There are many others, and I encourage you to read the chapter in the book that talks more about that.
In addition to those heuristics, one of the important characteristics that we talk about in our book is social identity and the role social identity plays in science, doubt, denial, and resistance. We're all tribal creatures, and we have particular groups that we feel a belonging, a sense of belonging with those groups, and we identify with them. And we use our group memberships as a sort of status and as a shortcut. So we conform sometimes just to the attitudes, norms, and behaviors of our group, rather than doing that system 2 work Barbara was talking about and thinking deeply about an issue. We may check in on Facebook and see what our friends are saying about a current issue. We know that in-group messages are more persuasive than the same exact message delivered from an outside person, someone who we perceive as outside our group. So this works both ways. We can be persuaded by someone on the in-group to accept science. We can also be persuaded by someone from an in-group to be resistant to scientific messaging. For example, we know that mothers groups questioned vaccine safety long before the coronavirus. And we've also seen that conservative media consumers have been very resistant to the idea of mask wearing as a useful way to slow the spread of the pandemic. So one way to think about this is we all have multiple identities. So if you want to reach a group that you care about and communicate a message about science, you can think about how to touch one of their identities that you can relate to. And maybe it's a slightly different identity group, but one that they belong to and that you belong to. Perhaps you're both grandparents and you're thinking about the future of the health and safety of the planet. You could perhaps use your grandparent identity and have that be a way to relate to somebody who has questions about science. We all can fall prey to motivated reasoning, another issue we discussed in our book. Motivated reasoning is just deciding what evidence to accept or reject based on a conclusion we really prefer to be the correct conclusion rather than the accurate one. Individuals tend to be much more critical of the methods of a particular research study if they don't like the outcome. They're like, oh, that study wasn't great because it didn't show what I already believe to be true. Identity, we just talked about, can really influence how we reason and can push us towards a preferred conclusion. And we see this because sometimes particular scientific findings are highly correlated with political affiliations. And an example would be climate change, but there's many others, how people feel about GMOs and how people feel about nuclear power and how people feel about other scientific issues can really be correlated with their political points of view. We see this differs definitely with climate change, but we know that liberals are also less likely to accept things like nuclear energy is an example. In Southern California, where I live, there's a lot of resistance to the safety of eating genetically modified foods, and scientists agree that despite problems with the whole industry around GMOs, the safety of consuming GMOs is something scientists agree on. So it really can influence how we look at how our social identity informs our motivated reasoning, and that can really influence how we look at a scientific issue.
Another psychological construct that's less well known, not likely to be in the news under this guise, but is what we think of as epistemic cognition, which is, an epistemic really refers to knowledge and knowing. So, and cognitive is our minds, how we think. So this is how individuals think and reason about knowledge and knowing and how they apply those beliefs. And Gale and I've written several articles looking at how that influences science understanding, what we think is knowledge, what we think the sources of knowledge are, et cetera. And it's a really critical process when you have to decide, well, what does count as evidence? And what do I do about the fact that there are competing claims here on this topic? How do I resolve that? Who do I trust? What authorities do I value? What seems likely to be true here? It involves evaluating information critically. And when you have to integrate multiple sources of information, you're calling on your epistemic cognition, and also as you incorporate new knowledge. And I'm not going to go into detail about this topic. Again, the book has a whole chapter on this, but I want to share with you one component of it that I thought might be of particular interest to this group. And that is epistemic trust. So we think about, again, if epistemic is about knowledge and knowing, well, what do we trust? And so this is about the sources of knowledge that individuals accept as valid and reliable. And that, of course, can be influenced by social identity. So you can think about something as basic as, what news sources do people trust? Where do they decide to go to for decisions they make about dealing with the pandemic? Should they wear a mask? Should they get vaccinated? What do they decide? Often that's based on their identity. Their social identity often determines who they think is a worthy authority in those particular areas. And yet we need to also recognize their reasons for distrust, particularly among minority communities. And often the Tuskegee experiment is given as an example of just the horrific kind of crimes that were committed, really, in terms of ways that minority groups began to distrust a medical establishment and whether that has continued or not. Critical is to know that individuals have more than one epistemic authority. It's not as though we all just go to our parents or a teacher or a religious leader. And sometimes these authorities are in conflict, and we have to worry about how individuals resolve the conflicts that they have. I've been reading stories lately of the 1 million people who died in COVID in the US so far, and the stories of what authorities they often trusted that turned out to have seriously let them down. I mean, one man who left 4 kids behind because his Facebook group told him that he was going to get chips put into him if he had vaccination. I mean, that's really problematic. And yet there are other authorities who might have been persuasive, who might have helped him out of that. When I had a friend who did not want to get vaccinated, I suggested he talk to his doctor. And his doctor, because he had health issues that he thought would forbid him to get vaccinated. And the doctor said, oh, no, those are the very reasons you need to. Well, that was an epistemic authority in his life. He got vaccinated the next day. And churches are really powerful in this regard. I mean, we can learn from community examples of where trust has been built, churches that fostered vaccine encouragement. There was a story in the news a year ago of a church that was 75% Black in Florida that had lost 6 members. 6 members had died of COVID in a very short period of time. And the pastor was really concerned. And he gave a beautiful sermon on it and then opened up a vaccination clinic outside the church at that point. And 200 people got vaccinated that day. I mean, this is really critical to think about what role can religious leaders play as epistemic authorities. In one study, 75% of vaccine-resistant Black individuals said that they would be most likely to trust their religious leaders. So there's a big role for religious leaders to play here in thinking about how to be an epistemic authority, how to build epistemic trust, how to model and reflect science back to people. So what can we do about science denial? I mean, this was a really important part of the book for us, is we really did not want to just talk once again about, oh, there are these awful problems, but we really wanted to address the issue. So if you haven't read the book yet and you're one of the people who got a copy or you get a copy, I encourage you to look at the end of every chapter has a section on what can we do. And then at the end, we have a whole chapter on what can we do about science denial. And the first of these is, what can individuals do? Well, I'll go back to the scientific attitude, this notion that we can cultivate scientific attitude in those we work with. In other words, helping them be open to evidence and open to changing their mind. And we can nurture science appreciation in others. I'm a grandparent of 2 9-year-olds, and since they were born, I've been taking them out on nature walks and giving them science kits and doing experiments with them. We can do this with the people in our lives. We can do it more broadly. We also need to improve search skills, and Gale's going to talk about how to do that, how to evaluate scientific claims and sources. We can become aware of our cognitive biases and motivations. And it's not as though they're going to go away. It's more a matter of checking them, going, aha, I wanted to believe that because I already believed it, and that fit with what I think. So that's confirmation bias. I think I'll go a little deeper. Another is to learn to listen to others with curiosity, compassion, and openness. I suspect that in this audience, that's something you're learning to do in your training. But for many people, this is really difficult. And helping your parishioners learn to do this, to listen to others with curiosity, compassion, and openness, is really, really important. Get curious, figure out why people think what they think. And then vote for those who value, support, and fund science, and who base their policy decisions on evidence.
Well, as Barbara mentioned, we all have to get better on sourcing information we find online. You know, it's become very difficult to sort out the information that we are seeing online about science. The people who are purveyors of mis and disinformation are getting very clever in how they disguise it. And so what you have to do when you read a scientific article online is stop, step back, be vigilant, employ that system one thinking. Instead of just sharing an article because it had an intriguing scientific finding, an interesting finding, wait and give yourself a minute to think about it. Scan the article first and ask yourself, is this explanation plausible? How do I know? And you can employ some of the fact-checking skills that journalists use for fact-checking. Read laterally, not vertically. What does that mean? Well, when you Google something, there's a list of sources that come up, and people think those come up in some order of veracity, but that's not at all true. They come up by how many people have clicked on things before, and those that have gotten a lot of clicks are very high up. It doesn't mean they're more accurate. In fact, often they're less accurate. So open a new window and do some research on the source and do some research on their expertise. You know, are they talking about clean coal? And then you find out they work for a coal manufacturer. Like, find out what their motivations are for sharing this information. See if you can find other experts that can corroborate that information. Then you want to evaluate the connection between the evidence, sources, and alternative claims. In other words, if this isn't true, is the alternative potentially true? Is there support for the other side? You have to really think about both sides of an issue. And then you can make a judgment about whether or not the claim is plausible. Barbara and I's favorite study that we like to think about is one that showed that postmenopausal women lost weight by eating chocolate for breakfast. We both are very motivated to believe that study, but every time we examine it, it just doesn't ring true because it had a very small sample size. We haven't seen it replicated. It really does not seem plausible to us to believe that study just yet. We're going to wait. Our tentative conclusion is we're going to wait until we make a judgment on it, until we see better evidence. And then after you've done that, only share information you verified. If you weren't able to verify it, don't share it. And then when you do share it, share not just what you know, but how you know it. So I read this new information about the variant of coronavirus from the CDC or from a reliable source. I'm sure you all want to think about what religious leaders can do to help in this area of science doubt, denial, and resistance. I would say give members of faith a place to stand by showing that it's possible to reconcile science and faith. There's a lot of different ways that people can do this. There isn't one solution for people any more than there's one perspective on faith. Stephen Jay Gould talked about, sorry about that typo there, in 1999, Stephen Jay Gould talked about non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, this is the view that science and religion ask and answer different questions. Science looks at the natural world and it can't answer questions about whether there's a God or what does it mean to be a good person. It just doesn't have the ability to even address those questions. So what Gould talked about is you can use science to look at the natural world, and you can use religion to answer questions of faith, morality, and the spiritual world. There's also examples of scientists who've had personal reconciliations of their faith with science. An example would be an excellent book written by Ken Miller, who's now the director of the National Center for Science Education and himself an evolutionary cell biologist. He wrote a great book back in 2007 called Finding Darwin's God, about his own personal journey as a person of faith and a scientist. Francis Collins, famously, the former director of NIH, who was part of the team that was able to unlock the genetic code, he wrote that made him more of a person of faith. And he wrote about that in his book, The Language of God. So these are different ways people have reconciled. But the important thing, I think, to let individuals know is that it's up to you as an individual to think about the different possible ways that you could reconcile your feelings as a person of faith with the evidence that the scientific community provides about the natural world. And as a faith leader, you can model that you understand and accept science, and you can model, as Barbara said, how to be an epistemic authority. I've worked with science educators, Elizabeth Barnes and Sarah Brownell, who teach evangelical college students about evolution. One of the ways that they do that is by bringing in scientists who are people of faith, and have the scientists, again, share their work, both in science and how they think about science as a person of faith. What can you do as an educator? Many of you are educators. Enhance your own science understanding. Part of the challenge is that educators in K through 12 and even in higher ed don't necessarily have deep scientific understanding if they're not a scientist themselves. In K through 12 education, we encourage teachers to teach about the nature of science. What is science, and how does it know what it knows? We encourage teachers to foster this scientific attitude that Barbara talked about, and to foster scientific thinking in all students, whether they're going to go on to be a scientist or not, because science is useful in your day-to-day life. We need to teach science through real world applications. We've seen how important that is in this past couple of years. And we need to let students choose the areas of science and topics of science that they want to do inquiry in, and let them explore those issues for themselves. Teachers need to be aware that students have strong prior beliefs, attitudes, and identities, and that some of them may have been told by family members or friends that their faith is in conflict with science. And so the students need that place to stand to think about their own faith and their own science that they're learning, and letting them know that it's okay to have these questions. Recognize that it may be emotional for students. And again, foster that kind of digital scientific literacy to research scientific topics online that we talked about. What can science communicators do? Well, they can write about science for the general public, and we encourage them to write about how scientists know what they know, as much as just reporting the news about science. And we want science communicators to really know and understand their science, their audience's misconceptions, motives, attitudes, emotions, and identities. I just spoke to a group of reporters from a major national newspaper, and they asked us not to say which one, but it is a big one, about how to understand their audience's views on science and to share those scientific pieces of news in a way that is more consumable for the general public. Providing the evidence for the scientific claims they're writing about, and avoiding that both sidesism we talked about, especially when reporting on settled science, so that we don't create this biased view.
And what can policymakers do finally? So we're really interested in how people marshal science in their role as policymakers. They can hire and listen to science advisors and use empirical evidence as a basis for policy. This is just so critical to think about how you put people around you who do know science and who can advise on it. They can support educational standards that emphasize how to think over what to think. Push back on ignoring factual basis of claims. We need to see much more pushback on that. We talk about being in a post-truth society, and what does that mean? What does it mean that somehow it all seems up for grabs? Well, how do we reinstantiate this valuing of truth and this valuing of the factual basis of claims. Policymakers can also demand rigorous teacher preparation standards. We know that most science teachers do not have a full science training background, and they can press social media toward responsibility, transparency, and accountability. And we're starting to see some of that happen. I think that's a good sign. And that is it. We want to thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you. We thank you for your time and your attention, and we hope you have some questions, and we look forward to engaging. And if you happen to be seeing this later in the recording, please feel free to reach out then.
Well, I just want to give you a rounding of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And now the fun really begins, because we have a group of people who have lots of questions. And our very first question is from Karen Tate. She has a master's in chemistry, and she is also is working on her master's of divinity. Her question is, how can I best help with this dialogue? Now, before we get to that, I just want to say that there are people who are bridge builders between these two domains. And so this is exciting, because I think of people like Catherine Hayhoe and Francis Collins, that you mentioned already, these kind of popular science people who can also translate, I think, between both worlds. So.
Well, Catherine Hayhoe is an excellent example. She's an amazing scientist and a person of faith, and she talks openly and writes books about her own faith and her science. And I think we were talking about in-groups earlier, and to be able for people of faith to see scientists of faith is really important. My collaborations with my colleagues I mentioned, they do that. They bring scientists in who are people of faith. And Kate was asking, how can you best contribute to this dialogue? I think by doing that, by sharing your own views on science. And if you've had any questions in your personal journey regarding issues of reconciliation between faith and science, sharing how you've dealt with those. Everyone will make their own personal decisions, but they need to see examples, because they hear a lot of terrible things about, oh, you can't be a person of faith and a scientist. And that just isn't the case. There's many people who are both, and there isn't one solution to that. So I think it's important to see examples and to let people know that they can come to some of those reconciliations, as other people famously have done.
Okay, thank you very much, Gale and Barbara, for that. Our next question, actually, you kind of already touched on, which is, what did you think of Catherine Hayhoe? We have.
I just want to say, if people have not heard some of her interviews on podcasts, I just strongly recommend it. She did one with Krista Tippett on being. That's just one of my all-time favorites. If you want to hear her talk about this and how she got where she is, it's a lovely piece.
Yeah, and I'd recommend Krista Tippett for your audience, because she is a person who talks about faith and science a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for those resources. I will look at buying them. Another question we had was around the idea of not to focus on further science, but on fully focusing on relationships to heal the divide.
Yes, I think there's too many people out there who are negative, maybe negative about people of faith, which is terrible, or negative about scientists, or scientists who are very negative about faith. I mean, that's not good. We encourage everyone of all faiths, or people of no faith, to look at science for what it is and what its utility value is to our daily life. And I personally don't have any problem at all with people who have had different reconciliations between their views of faith and science. As I mentioned, we feel like science really is in a certain realm and it's contained in that realm. It's about the natural world and the mechanisms in the natural world. And as one of my former students of faith used to say to me, you know, if it's in the natural world, I feel God created the natural world, so I'm fine with whatever the science says about the natural world. So different people have different ways they look at it through their faith lens. And, you know, people should be allowed to have those conversations with science educators and with faith educators as well.
Thank you so much for that response, Gail. We have a two-parter question now. This one is a gotcha kind of question. No, I'm kidding. Okay, we have, do you think the potential benefits of social media platform usage can outweigh the potential negative aspects of using these platforms? Do you encourage people to use social media with similar caveats to those of driving a car? Be careful, you can hurt someone, or you can hurt yourself or someone else.
I really like that. I think that's a really good way to think about it. And I don't think we're all going to abandon social media. That's not going to happen. What we need to do is figure out how to hold social media accountable. And unfortunately, we may be going in the wrong direction with allowing Elon Musk to buy Twitter. That really has some concern there. I mean, it was only the day before that happened on Earth Day that Twitter decided they were no longer going to allow climate misinformation. Climate denial had no place on Twitter. Well, we'll see what happens to that. But I think we are all going to need to be increasingly vigilant about our use of it and about the ways in which we understand, and we need to understand, why are we seeing what we're seeing? Why is that being returned to me? And then how can I also reach out and have broader conversations? Gail and I are both on Twitter, and we have appreciated being able to connect with people that we wouldn't otherwise talk with about these issues, that people find us, we have conversations. I think it's a platform that can be used in a lot of different ways.
And you know, when I talk with people, I often tell them, you know, most of the science we receive, as you said, is mediated in some form. It's either through films, you know, help us all, we get our genetics from films, but also things like newspapers and magazines, you know, who usually frame the science in a certain way, right? It's either, sometimes we get a conflict frame, other times we get this kind of discovery, isn't it wonderful? This is going to change mankind kind of frame. And so these are the kind of things that that form how the media portrays it. But with social media, you just have such a kind of free-for-all, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
I almost feel like, as someone who studied information science, that we need a new type of media technology to deal specifically with information, misinformation, and disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, movies portray scientists either as sort of crazy, you know, the mad scientist who has some crazy plot to take over the world and doesn't care about humanity, or in the absolute opposite. And like you were saying, Yolanda, that they have some insight, you know, like the God complex kind of idea of a scientist who has this insight, who thinks that they've figured everything out. Well, of course, scientists aren't in real life like either of those. Scientists are just real people who have a certain area of expertise, and it's usually pretty narrow. It's usually in just one area. And so, you know, it really is, it behooves us to understand a little bit better about how scientists do their work and what their expertise is in. And if you are a engineer, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily a climate expert. And if you're a climate scientist, it doesn't mean you necessarily know anything about vaccines. So scientists are limited in their own way to their own expertise.
And I think your point about the media is really important. Where do we get these ideas, and how is it that people draw their beliefs about science from the media? One of the things that Gale and I did a few months ago is we wrote a piece in response to the Don't Look Up film, and it has now been read as of today 310,000 times. And more than half of those are outside the US. And so it shows that people are eager to make sense of the media that they interpret, that they view. They want to know more about it. And we felt like this is a good opportunity for us to talk about themes of climate denial within the film and how those played out. And it's just a short piece. We're happy to give you the link if people want to see it.
We would definitely love to have that link. And
I'd like to answer Wes's question. There's a great question in chat about principles for ethical science communication online. I think that's an excellent question. Yeah. One of the things that I would say communicating with a lot of science communicators is, that they should share what they know, what scientists know that they're reporting on, and what they don't know, and how do they know it. So a lot of times they'll just report the facts and they won't give the context of those facts to the reader. And so those facts have to be put in a context. So I think that's one of the most important things. And then in terms of the ethics, I would say, obviously, caveating what needs to be caveated. In other words, if they're not fully certain, they should say that. But at the same time, if there is a great deal of certainty, they should not present it is as if it isn't. So that sort of speaks to a little bit about Joseph's question next, which is, what science, to rely on. Barbara and I always say consensus science, back to the IPCC report, which is a huge compilation of research evidence across many scientists, many studies, many years, different countries, different disciplines, all with the same conclusions coming together about humans contributing to the warming. That's something we feel you can put your trust in, your epistemic trust in, whereas the one-off 22 participant chocolate study is probably one we'd want to be more skeptical of.
I was just thinking also about how sometimes scientists will use grandiose words. Like I remember when the Human Genome Project was coming, it was the Book of Life, it was the Code of God, it was all of these things, and so you also kind of have to be aware that when scientists use religious language, that they don't use it literally. Oftentimes it's kind of a inside joke almost, but or it may be something else, but it can't be taken at face value that that's actually what they're meaning. So,
but there really is something called the God complex, which is that scientists who discover something quite perhaps a new planet or something that's really profound, they kind of get carried away. It's a thing that people talk about in science. If someone cures cancer, they may get carried away with their wonderful accomplishments. So it's both sides, right? They're neither crazy mad scientists, nor are they gods. They're normal human beings who, through hard work, provide evidence about the natural world and how it works. Nothing more and nothing less.
If the two of you could look at Joseph Carney's question and consider it's a long question. He is a scientist with a doctorate in biomedical engineering. So I'll let you read it, and kind of the two of you can talk.
Barbara, you want to take that one as epistemic expert?
Am I reading the right one about the fluidity of scientific knowledge? Yeah,
yes.
I think you just addressed that to some degree. So I think this is not a clear-cut line. It is not there's not some standard of measure, as he well knows, I'm speaking to the choir here, that suddenly science is settled. It's an evolving process where we begin to incrementally learn more and more until we think we know enough. And I think that's where we are with climate change right now, is that we're finding that climate scientists have no dispute with the knowledge that climate change is human caused, that there are these anthropogenic causes for it. And I think that becomes settled science at that point. But it's certainly not the case that we're not going to continue to learn more. We're going to find out more and more about climate change and about its effects and about timelines. And if anything, scientists are generally very conservative. I mean, many of them are troubled by the fact that they took a conservative stance toward climate change and were not able to accurately predict where we would already be right now. They thought it would be longer before we would be where we are in terms of the kind of crises that we're seeing on a global level. So I don't have an easy answer. I wish we could interact and we could hear from Joseph what he thinks about this.
And then some things that are, quote, settled science today, may be unsettled in the future. Yeah. And I think that's, people attack science sometimes by saying, oh, but science changes. And, Barbara and I feel like a strength of science is its adaptability and change based on new evidence. The fact that it can change when new evidence comes along is one of the strengths of science.
Yeah.
There's Joseph.
There he is.
Hi, how are you all this evening?
Great.
Thank you.
So essentially, my question is based on the fact that oftentimes settled science, for instance, climate change, I don't think anyone really disagrees that the climate is changing. I don't think anyone really disagrees that mankind has contributed to that change over the years. But there is a lot of disagreement as to where our technology is right now, as to what we can actually do about it. There are those on one side that say we have to ban all fossil fuels now, because if we don't do that, the world will come to an end, and then we'll all be gone and nothing will be happening. I'm also a pastor at the same time, so I hear these kinds of things all the time. Sometimes we just simply we don't have enough knowledge to know what we can do about it at this point in time. So there's certainly, even within settled science, there's disagreement about what we can do about it, or what.
Yeah,
definitely.
You're absolutely right, Pastor. And the thing that's interesting is that people conflate those two, and you were adept at separating them. So people conflate, the science isn't settled on climate change because we don't know what to do about it. But you were careful to say, we do know that humans are contributing to climate change,
sure,
but there's still debate about what to do about it. And that's exactly how we need to talk about it.
Yes.
We don't know if carbon capture is going to work. We don't know how many degrees we're really going to change in terms of temperature globally. So there's a lot of things that we don't know, and there's a lot of solutions that are yet unproven, but we know certain facts, which is we're causing things to be much worse, and we need to make some significant changes. And we need to be focusing our attention on investigating those changes to get that part of the science more secure than it is, instead of debating about whether climate change is happening. And I think people are moving away from that, but I think sometimes they use the unsettled solutions debates as an excuse to say, oh, humans aren't contributing to climate change, which I think most people now understand we are.
Sure, agreed.
Thank you, Dr. Carney. Did you have more to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think the debate is always exactly that. We understand something's happening, but we don't always have a solution to it. For the longest time in my particular field, when hearts and lungs stopped working, at one point the technology was, there's nothing we can do about it, and that unfortunately that person is going to pass away. But in my field, we eventually got to the point where that's no longer the case. we now have ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, where we can breathe for the take over the function of the lungs as long as the heart's working. Or if the heart's not working, we have LVADs, left ventricular assist devices, where we can use technology to keep that heart working while we find a donor for either one of those organs, which 50 years ago was impossible to do. So solutions are what we debate about, I think, not whether or not something's happening or not. When a person's heart is 4 times the size of their head, it's not working very well anymore. We know that there's something wrong there. That's settled.
Well, you're so right. And I
What
think,
changes.
yeah, you're so right. And there are people who I think try to shift the conversation because they're not comfortable with solutions. So I was at a conference with a climate educator from Texas, and he said, all my neighbors say they deny humans are contributing to climate change, but when I talk with them, they really know that we are. They just don't want to change their lifestyles. They own big trucks and they don't want to stop driving those vehicles. They don't want to change their lifestyles. Well, that's just using, an excuse to say denial of climate change, when really they're in denial of the fact that we're probably all going to have to make some changes in our lifestyles.
And I remember hearing that unsettled science argument a lot during the pandemic when it came to the vaccine. It's not settled. We don't know. I'm going to wait to see what is going to happen with other people.
Yeah.
And, so this notion of the unsettled, I think some of it is based on kind of a misunderstanding of science process and how consensus comes about, but it's definitely been a great excuse to not get vaccinated.
Yeah, where we should be just thrilled with how rapidly science responded to get us vaccines so much faster than anybody thought could happen. The number of things that have happened through the scientific establishment in order to try to make this less lethal than it has been are profound. And yet, for all these other psychological reasons, people have resisted some of those very things.
And, I have a neighbor who never got vaccinated, and she says, well, 10 years from now, we'll see, how people are who were vaccinated. And I keep thinking, well, fortunately, 10 years from now, hopefully most of those people who were vaccinated will be around. So we'll be able to see what happens. And at least we gave them those 10 years. I mean, she's 70 years old. And I'm like, well, I hope you're here when you're 80 to find out what happened to everybody in the interim 10 years. I mean, sometimes you have to look at the risk assessment, right? You have to weigh the risk of potential side effects from a vaccine versus the risk of dying of the coronavirus. And as Barbara mentioned, many of the 1 million people who passed away didn't weigh those risks. Some people just got exposed, but others made conscious decisions to not get vaccinated because they were weighing the risks in a way that didn't work out.
Yes, exactly. Well, I want to invite you, if there's any other last words of wisdom you would love to leave our students, our faculty, our constituencies, local pastors. We would love to receive that. And
a final thing I would say is that somebody raised a question about what do we do about the big divide? And we answered that in certain ways, but it occurs to me that there's a bigger divide. It isn't just between science and denial. There's a divide in this country right now. And I think religious leaders are in a really wonderful position to try to create conversations across that divide, to try to bring humans together one-to-one, to talk about the things they believe and to try to really learn to listen to each other. I think churches are a wonderful place for that to happen, for those conversations to go on where you can talk to someone who thinks differently than you do. We seem to be losing that ability in this country. And I worry about that enormously. And I know the conversations I've had with people who think very differently about the issues that Gale and I are talking about have been very rewarding. I mean, if I'm patient and curious and I spend time listening and I'm compassionate, I think we both come away with a better understanding of each other.
Yeah, and I would like to encourage your members to, take leadership in the faith and science communities. There are some people who are espousing to be people of faith who are saying, terrible things like, let grandma die so we can get the economy back going. It's not something I think is consistent with most people's faith-based views. And so I think we need to get back to first principles and to, get people's thinking about morality and faith and science a little bit back to some common principles that we might all be able to get behind a little bit better.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of this digital dialogue. And we thank you so much for joining us here at MTSO for our Science for Seminaries. I would love to thank Dr. Barbara Hofer. Am I saying it correctly?
Hofer, long O.
Hofer. I apologize. Dr.
Okay.
Barbara Hofer and Dr. Gale Sinatra, the authors of the book, Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for this opportunity.